Hi, my name is Natalie Soghomonian. I'm currently an Equality, Diversity and Inclusion student journalist, part of the History of Art department. I'm here with Baylee Woodley, who's one of our PhD students who will be sharing a little bit about their research and interests. Baylee, did you want to do a bit of an introduction for people viewing?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for inviting me. I was very flattered to be asked. And yeah, I'm a PhD student. I'm from the west coast of Canada, and I'm here working with Robert Mills and Cadence Kinsey, which has been really fabulous. Yeah, I mean, I think we'll get to the rest probably.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so obviously you're doing a PhD here at UCL and in the History of Art department. Just to sort of start things off, I was just curious, how did your interest start in the arts and what drew you to art, like history of art as a subject, really? Like, how did that begin?
Yeah, I mean, I guess arts generally have always been very important to me. When I was younger, it was mostly performing arts and making costumes with my mom. And then art history, I think my very first flavor came from my grandma, who volunteered at the Vancouver Art Gallery and had all the gorgeous coffee table books out all the time. But I didn't know it was a discipline until I got to university. So I started my undergrad in English and medieval studies. But then I had this fabulous professor who introduced me to art history, and I realized that you could do there were so many tunnels from art history that you could do, like religious studies and languages and social history and visual culture and media studies. It just seemed like you could be endlessly enthusiastic about anything. So that's why.
I think definitely, and art history sometimes is very much almost like English literature, but with the visuals, and it adds this sort of other element. And it's the same things, like religion, social context, and all these things are intertwined within it, but it's become visual, which I think is really interesting. And I think, from what I know, you've started off with English literature and you've sort of traveled up to sort of art history. How has your journey been in terms of doing your master's and then moving into your PhD? What kind of things did you research at master's level?
Yeah. So my question at the time when I first started was very, very basic. I felt that probably there were medieval lesbians, but no one had ever mentioned them.
Yeah.
And so when I went back to do my master's, that was the question initially. And I was very lucky because I had a master's supervisor who then would stay up researching until 4 o'clock in the morning and send me all these emails with what she had found about medieval lesbians. And so it was a really gorgeous collaboration. And then I came across a website called Queer Art History, and it was started by a young scholar, an activist, and artist in the States named Casey Hoke. And I sort of took that on midway through my master's to carry on his legacy, and his family's been amazing, and we've worked together. And so then my MA sort of took a veer into art history and the digital humanities and sort of archiving queer materials. And now it's circled back around for the PhD to be more.
These sort of side interests and sort of projects have sort of tailored how you're approaching your kind of next steps, really, which is really interesting. That's really amazing. And what kind of things, so do you look through the archive, is that right? And then you find things in relation to queer art history? Is that how that works? Is that how the project works?
Yeah, so when I first took it on, it was nice timing that it was during my master's, because I wanted to really take time to sort of get into the site and think, how had Casey organized it? What were his priorities? And so doing the master's, I was sort of it was about sinking into the site and then being really intentional with where I took it. So that was lovely, sort of reflective time.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the main there, but now it's about just sort of bringing it forward. I'd love to start a podcast, but that's in the future.
That's amazing to talk about. I think especially talking about things like that really spreads the awareness of things that maybe people didn't maybe hear of, especially in art history, which is really, really fascinating. And so you studied, if I'm right, you did your undergraduate degrees and masters. Is that in Canada? Was that right? Is that where you did?
It's at the University of Victoria, which is on Lekwungen, Esquimalt and Wasanich territory, sort of on Vancouver Island. And yeah, it's a gorgeous university. And it's all sort of like in a circle surrounded by a forest.
Really nice environment to be in studying as well.
Yeah.
So how does your education sort of differ? How have you found the education in the UK compared to back home? And as well with studying art history, is there like different approaches that you've felt here compared to back home?
Yeah, there are differences. I found them very hard to name. I talked to this about people who moved to the UK from Canada. They're like, there's kind of a culture shock, but you can't quite name it because everything looks the same. And especially from Victoria, because Victoria, our architecture, we try very hard to be British. Like our tourist buses are red double-decker buses, and our Parliament buildings look like the British Parliament buildings. But I think that I found conferences in the UK somehow more relaxed and collaborative, which is a nice shift. And then maybe more day-to-day academia is more relaxed and collaborative, sort of in the department where I came from. But that's also, I mean, I was there for about 7 years, so, and it's a small department, so we were all just friends by the end, I think.
Like it's quite a nice community in that sense, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think the other big thing is that coming to the UK, it's interesting to see the education that people got in high school here, and I definitely felt that difference. It's like, oh, you were reading Virgil in grade 11, you know. And so it's been.
I was not, but some people might.
Oh, good. Good. I was talking to a woman last week, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I read Virgil in high school, or you know, her version in high school." Which, and then I had to go read it, but.
Definitely a lot of differences in terms of that. So obviously now you're doing your PhD here at UCL, which is amazing and it's very exciting for you. I thought maybe it's best you could briefly introduce to listeners or viewers about your research, your focus, maybe your interests, and sort of, how it kind of led you on to doing what you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah, I feel very lucky because I feel like you said sort of about the masters, I feel that I've, as I go, been able to weave in everything that I'm really passionate about. So it just feels really juicy and delightful. And I'm working with Bob, who's been thinking through a lot of the things that I'm thinking through in his own work. And so that's been incredible sort of to learn from him. But yeah, so my broader question is queer femininities, and then mostly late medieval queer femininities in England. I hop into France for the second chapter because there's some fabulous sort of trans lesbian potentials in manuscripts from there. And then I also put those medieval femininities in conversation with the queer femininities being explored by contemporary UK-based performance artists. And the idea is to sort of suggest that both of them and sort of all the possibilities that they offer can sort of feed each other and maybe help draw out nuances and possibilities that we wouldn't see otherwise, that we haven't had vocabulary for before. So that's the grand aspiration.
I think what I was looking at when I was seeing the research is that there is this amazing collaboration between this sort of contemporary sphere that is very potentially relatable to people now, and also looking back at these identities and maybe norms at the time and comparing the two together and finding parallels or marrying the two together. I think that's a really interesting approach to research. How have you felt that you've sort of explored sort of your own personal things through this project? Are there things in your personal life that has sort of influenced this interest at all?
Yeah, definitely. So as I started my master's, I also started doing drag and burlesque, which was all about queer femininity, but I'd also very recently come out. So it was just this, like, I waited, and then it was all very fast and sparkly and on stage and then on a research poster. So I think that all the questions have sort of fed into each other. I think I was looking for a legacy for the personal things that I was exploring, as well as noticing academic gaps that maybe I could start to fill. Yeah.
No, please go on, it's fine.
I was just going to say, I think as well, like the embodied experience of queer femininity and also the performativity of it. Those were also some parallel questions in the personal and the professional.
I think what's really interesting is, you know, it was kind of like a lot of journeys going on with this project, like, and with your research, it feels like, you know, answering these bigger questions, especially in the contemporary sphere and what's happening at the moment in art history and exploring these ideas, but also it's also quite a personal journey as well, which I think is really amazing. And I think, especially with me, I can kind of relate to in terms of research. And I think that's what it's about. It's a very sort of human focused, people focused project, which I think is really amazing in the long run. definitely makes me drawn to the research and reading it and seeing it reflects in art history, which I think is really, really needed. Has there been specific exhibitions or artworks or research really that has kind of maybe influenced this research, or key things that you found in research that have kind of sparked interest?
It's a big question because there have been many things. In terms of contemporary artists, I think going to drag shows, to be honest, has been a really big influence for me. So I went to see Sound of the Underground when it was on in February, and that was amazing and has woven into my third chapter, which has been lovely. And then Sin Wai Kin, who is sort of a drag performer, but also a multimedia artist. Their practice is really from the beginning. So in my initial PhD proposal, their practice was a big force. And then Tai Shani as well, who thankfully for me is really explicitly playing with the medieval. So it's very easy, because I can say not only do I believe that she's playing with the medieval, but she's citing,
She's
Christina
claiming it for herself as well. Yeah.
So that's been really lovely. And then there are just so many queer medievalists who are so lovely. I could name them, but I don't want to forget anyone. I guess like Diane Watt and Anna Kosowska I found during my master's, and then Bob, of course, I found during my master's and then have gone on to work with, which has been amazing. But yeah, there are just so many. We just had a queer medievalisms workshop. That's why I was in Oxford, which I mentioned before we started. And it's just incredible. I think it's an incredible community. So you're always exchanging ideas and always relating, I think, on a personal and an academic level, which makes it really rich.
I think it's really great that there's a sort of a community of people together talking about these ideas and bringing together this sort of medievalist, like analyzing medieval times, but also with these current interests. And it's nice to have that collaboration and bounce these ideas around with other colleagues and other people that you even know. And it makes that sort of research, it kind of sparks your kind of interest and pushes your own ideas as well, which is really, really great. Have there been any surprises you found in your research, or something that has sort of been maybe difficult to overcome or analyze potentially?
I think the most difficult bit and the most exciting bit is that femininity is very complicated. But I think that what I've just found it even richer than I thought. And there are experiences around femininity that I've sort of lived experiences that I've had, or things that I've read about in contemporary theory. There's a fem theory from sociology actually, which is a delightful surprise. That are sort of not just reflected, but made more complicated by the past. And I think that the intersections between things like femphobia and sexism and transphobia and racism and ableism and ageism, I think I've been able to explore all those things through exploring femininity even more than I expected, which has been really exciting. Sort of this,
it's almost like using femininity as the start point of this interconnecting web of ideas. Yeah,
exactly. And I think you sort of go in one spot, and then there's just a maze of things. Like art history, you can sort of explore anything from femininity, which has been even more than I expected when I started, which has been very exciting and very complicated. The introduction is going to be
but no, I think complicated is an important word, because I think obviously there is so many interconnections happening, but I think the complicated nature of it, though it is complicated, is the important part, and it's the root of the cause of the whole research, I think, in some way, which I think is really, really important to focus, which is great to, I think maybe it seems a bit, complicated, but it's actually probably the heart of the topic, which I think is great.
But I can call you then when I'm writing the introduction. I need a pep talk.
I need to get through the next couple of lines. So looking at these ideas, it's really not necessarily a reevaluation, but it's looking at the past, looking at the present, and especially with things that I'm interested, I like to look at what's going on in the contemporary sphere, what's happening in the art world at the moment, what are the exhibitions that are being put on. How do you see, with a sort of focus on equality, diversity, and inclusion for the journalism project, how do you see institutions at the moment promoting sort of equality, diversity, inclusion? And do you feel like basically where do you think that our representation of sort of current issues will be in the future? That's a big question, but how do you see it at the moment and where do you see it in the future?
Yeah, big but important question. I will try and do it justice. I think that some of the big institutions are taking the steps that queer theorists were taking several years ago. So sort of thinking we can name the people, like we can name the queers, for example. So the British Museum has an LGBTQ plus tour. And so I think that that's something that big institutions can do, and they can do it, I think, quite easily because history just is queer. Yeah. And so then they can draw them out and name some people and give that visibility, which is amazing. I don't want to disparage it. But I think the next step, particularly for big institutions, is going to be sort of what does it mean then to adopt like queer methodologies into your curating practice? What about sort of decolonizing your institution? What does that look like? And I think it needs to take those, it needs to get like a little anarchist, and take those things on board before, like for systemic change, I think is the next step. Queer Britain is a museum that I feel very excited about right now. Have you been there?
I haven't, but I've heard a lot about it recently in terms of it's happening, and it's really interesting to see.
Yeah. Yes, exactly, it is happening. Yeah, I would recommend that you go. And especially if you're interested in how different ways to do these things, because it's sort of a home space. It feels like a bit like a house, which is lovely. It reminds me of, there's a lesbian history archive in New York, and the whole idea is that it's in a house and someone lives there all the time, so it feels homey. And they have they had this video that was like, why is it important to be seen? And they had a bunch of UK artists and sort of residents sort of talking about these things. But yeah, it's just great. And they have like ephemera, sort of like protest signs next to Oscar Wilde's prison door, and it's just beautiful. It's just like a lovely. They have a library, like a tiny little library shelf, and I think that they're doing it right. You sort of walk in there. They've got an audience contribution section at the end where they ask you why is it important to be seen, and
exactly,
it's my favorite wall I've ever seen ever.
It's different to other institutions where sometimes especially bigger in like main institutions, whatever that means, but where it's not the word isn't necessarily performative, but it's it's trying to be at the same place as but things like Queer Britain, it is it is there for the people, and it is there as it's ignoring the rest of the sort of things that the bigger institutions are doing, which makes it a nice space, and it makes it a nice inclusive space for people, and like you said, almost homely in that way, which I think is a really nice sphere. I definitely need to go, but
it's so good.
But it's nice.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's nice that even there is a space, which I think is great.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think that what you said is so important about it's queer run and it's for queer communities. I was watching an interview about all of the drag legislation in the States, and someone was saying, it doesn't matter if you get it or not, because this is art from and for our community. And I think that I want to draw out what you said, because I think that's really key. That
it is.
Yeah.
It's important. I think that's. I was going to ask also about if you have any upcoming projects, really, in terms of like maybe your PhD, but also any other side projects you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, the Queer Art History website is an ongoing side project. I need to be better about the regular postings. But I've been put in touch with Jess, who works in the art history department as a lecturer, has put me in touch with some of their students who I think are going to contribute to the website. So that's really exciting. I signed up for too many conferences this summer, so that will be very exciting. And I'm working on a performance piece as well for October that is coming from the PhD research. So we will see how it looks when it's covered in glitter. But those are probably the main side projects.
Amazing, great. Well, it's been lovely speaking to you and hearing about your research and all your interests. Everything, it sounds really exciting, and I think it's gonna you know, really add to this sort of contemporary conversations, and also just, I think it's really interesting to listen about and see that sort of change happening through your research. I think that's really, really amazing. And if people did want to see any of your projects, so there's the Queer Art History page, is that right? The website? And then
Yes, yeah.
is there anything else that people can find you on, or is that the main place at the beginning?
I have a personal website, which also needs updating, but I think it's just bayleywoodley.org, which might come up if you Google it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, so much. And yeah, I will end that.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for your project.